Professor Govindswamy, can you tell me why is Japan taking such an interest in India?
Uh, I think a number of reasons. One would be that the Japanese economy has not been doing well for well over 2 decades now. They have sent their bulk of investments to China. If you see the FDI coming into China, the Japanese share is pretty large. They have not been interested in India because they were having their hands full with the Chinese investments as well as the Southeast Asian investments. They are all over Southeast Asia. Okay, there is something called as the Asian production network. Okay, so the Japanese had come up with this concept and developed this since about 1985. Okay, there is a historical reason for this. The Japanese trade friction with the US was pretty intense in the late 70s and the early 1980s. Okay, 1985 you have what is called as the Plaza Accord, which takes place in the US, where the US tells Japan that, and Germany and other major Western trading partners, that enough is enough. The US balance of trade with the rest of the world is reaching unsustainable levels. Okay, so what the US is going to do is it is going to let the dollar drop, okay, vis-a-vis the other foreign currencies, so that the US exports will increase, and that way the balance of trade can be wiped out. Okay, and US gave a stern warning saying that if the other countries meddle with the foreign exchange rates and try to prop up the US dollar, it's going to hit back. Now this comes after a number of threats that the US had given, and US made it very clear that it's not going to tolerate anymore. Okay, so from 1985 you find that the Japanese had to shift their production facilities abroad, because it is they could save quite a bit in low wage in the Southeast Asian nations. Now coincidentally, from 1978 you find China opening up. Okay, after a period of 6-7 years, the Japanese knew that the Chinese were genuine in their efforts at liberalization, etc. So the Japanese move much of their FDI to China, plus production facilities. Much of the manufacturing facilities in Japan has flowed out. You call it as the hollowing out of Japanese industry, right? Now, so the stakes that Japan has in China are pretty high, but there are lots of issues with China. Okay, in the initial honeymoon period is probably over now. Okay, there are problems, IPR related problems. Okay, then the Chinese, all we read in papers is how the mayor of a Chinese town comes to greet the visiting businessmen from China, Japan, from Japan or any other country, and escort him, and there is a single window clearance for FDI, etc. Now that I think that kind of nice story, I think, is more or less over now. There are lots of problems on the ground. There is a lot of technology pilfering, IPR related issues. Chinese are not honoring their commitments. So the honeymoon period is probably over now. Okay, now there are political issues. The Japanese, for example, Shinzo Abe's visit to Yasukuni Shrine has its backlash in China. Then there is the island dispute. Okay, so there are a lot of irritants. Okay, and China is exactly not very subtle in its expansionist policy, right? So it believes it is going to be the big brother in Asia and ultimately in the whole world, and it's slowly doing it. Surely it is doing it. So, for example, the air zone which the Chinese introduced recently, it runs over the disputed islands. Okay, so the Japanese want somebody to counter China also, Chinese expanding influence. Now, India is a potential ally in Asia. US is obviously there, but the US role is a little diminished today. It is because of the US security umbrella and the nuclear umbrella that the Japanese were able to hold against the Chinese till now, right? So now you can't be putting all your eggs in a single basket, right? So I think cultivating India economically is going to help them. And there is this you talk about aid fatigue. There can also be trade fatigue is what I feel. There can be FDI fatigue. Okay, so I think India is not exactly virgin territory for the Japanese, but they've been neglecting it. They didn't have any serious issues with India in the last 50 years, and so it was benign neglect. With China, they had serious issues. With Korea, they had serious issues. So they were engaging them. Right now, I think they are moving to India. Possibly, this could work in their favor when China becomes unmanageable. Okay.
My next question is, there have been recent reports coming out of Japan that there is something called the celibacy syndrome, where the youth of Japan has become uninterested in having relationships or getting married, because they say that it's because of, you know, pressure in society and everything, so that's they've become tired of it and they can't support relationships or whatever. Okay, there was a recent survey by the Family Planning Association of Japan saying that by 2060 most of the population, 40% of the population, would be over the age of 65. My question is, do you think that the government has been spooked by these numbers and has sought to sort of open up immigration to India, the second largest country in the world, in an attempt to save its shrinking population?
I think two aspects. The first is whether Japan is interested in migration of some population from India to Japan, so that the shortage in labor force is taken care of. That I think is not correct. See, Japan is a very insular society. It is very difficult for a foreigner. They can be extremely polite to you, but to break into their group, is going to be extremely difficult. So, for Japan to assimilate Indian population into its own society is something with I don't think any normal Japanese would be able to get over. See that the cultural disconnect is there. I've been there a number of times. I have very good friends, but to merge with the Japanese society is a separately different issue. Okay, so I don't think this the intention of the Japanese is to ensure that there is a migration of young labor force from India to Japan, so that the Japanese economy moves on with the same kind of momentum it has been showing. That is one. The second thing is the basic reason. You are talking about the 40% of population at a particular point of time. Now the figures are very high even now. I think it is 20% plus. Now this is something which takes place in the economic development of any country in the world. Okay, you call this as a demographic transition. What basically happens is that the share of what is happening is that you have the birth rate and the death rates, right? Now the birth rates start coming down basically because the health facilities keep increasing. As the economy matures, health facilities become better, right? So the birth rates fall. The death rates also fall because of health reasons. Okay, birth rates fall further because as the population becomes convinced that the life expectancy is rising, they tend to have lesser and lesser children. They invest more and more in less and less children in terms of education. You tend to have smaller families, but you give high quality education. That is one reason why the numbers come down. And giving higher education to a large family is not possible. And the earlier issues of, you have, let us say, 7-8 children, possibly 3-4 would die. And maybe out of the rest, 1 or 2 would take care of you in your old age. That logic doesn't apply anymore with urbanization and the availability of schooling, with income levels going up. So families tend to have smaller number. This is there in all countries in the world, right? Now Japan is probably an extreme case. It has developed very rapidly. You have to understand that the economic development when you're talking about economic growth or economic development, you need time. You can't have compressed, rapid economic development and expect that the society is going to be normal. It's going to impact society in different ways. Okay, right. Now, so the demographic transition has been taking place. People are having lesser and lesser number of children. Now, what has been happening since 1985? I talked about the Plaza Accord. From 1990 onwards, you have what is called as the economic bubble burst. There was a huge real estate bubble growing in Japan, and it burst in 1990 because of various complex reasons. Okay, since that time, the Japanese economy has been stagnating or posting negative growth rates. Now they call it as a lost decade. Now it is not a single decade; it's more than 2 decades now. It's going to be about 23, 24 years now. Okay, only now, the economy seems to be on some turnaround, right? So they lost this much. Now what has been happening in these last 2 decades or a little more? What has been happening? People have been depressed. People have been losing jobs. I talked about manufacturing jobs moving out of Japan. So the unemployment rates have been going up. Okay, now people are not interested in going for higher education. People are not registering for PhDs. If at all they were, the kind of topics they were choosing are very depressive, negative topics. What is the future of Japan? Are we going to survive? Things like this, right? So, from a bright, expectant society in the 60s and 70s, when the future was always alluring, bright, it is completely the other extreme today. So, people are not interested in going in for marriage. Women are not interested. The marriage age has shot up. I think it is average is more than 29 today for women. Earlier it was 25. You can easily get these figures.
Yes.
Now, so why are they are not interested? Okay. Now, okay, you get married. You won't be able to buy an apartment for yourself.
Yes.
It is so expensive. So, and you keep saving money. You apply for loan. When I went to Japan as a student in the early 1980s, I know very well that you apply for a loan to buy an apartment. You go to the bank, you sign the document, and you keep paying money. By the time you retire, you more or less have paid it, and the apartment becomes yours, and maybe you live in it for a few years, and then you pass it on to your son. You are no more. Yes. Now, what is happening in the last 2 decades is that when you go to apply for the loan, you take your son along. He signs the contract. After your life, the son will continue to pay for the mortgage.
Really?
So that is long term. It is so expensive. People are not able to afford it. Now, if it becomes impossible, you forget it. So women are not even going for buying an apartment or going for a marriage because the future is so bleak. So it is better if you have some savings. Go for foreign travel, make a Hawaii trip, go to USA, see Canada. Blow up the money and have a good time, stay in a rented apartment or whatever, and that's it. So the what do you call disenchantment with not life, but good living maybe. The future is not enticing as it used to be earlier. So marriage is not something that they really look forward to.
But they're not really poor, are they? Japanese society.
No, they're not poor. They're not.
There's a lot of welfare that comes from the government.
I don't know. You see, the problem is this. If you're talking about increasing share of the people above 65 in the population, the problem is this. When you talk about labor force, you take 15 to 65. This is the ILO classification, right?
Yes.
So people from 0 to 15 cannot work. People above 65 would not be able to contribute much to the state revenue,
yes.
Right? It is 15 to 65 who are set to contribute. In the case of Japan, let's say it is from 2022, because then people enter jobs,
yes.
Okay, to 65. Now what is happening is that this share of the population is slightly shrinking, and the 65 plus share of the population is enlarging. Okay, so the state has to take care of an increasingly large share of the population which does not pay taxes, and the share of the population which is working, which pays taxes, finds that the financial burden on it is increasing more and more, particularly at a time when Japan is not posting any good growth rates. So the pressure on them is very high. You see, for example, they had the sales tax which was at 3%. Now it has been increased to 5%. there was tremendous opposition across the board from the population. 5% sales tax, and in Japan, most of the sales are above board, and it is documented. So you pay 5%.
Yes.
That's going to rise to 10%.
So
Okay, next year I think.
next year.
Okay, and it's going to be, it hurts the population heavily. Now the savings, they are saving, expecting that the government will not be able to do much for them in their, when they are retiring, and the social security is going to be much less. So the financial crunch on the state is extremely high. Okay, so I think these are the basic issues. Looked at it. So the state is not coming up with some fantastic new plan, which is giving some kind of a enthusiasm to the Japanese. Abe talks about his, the three approaches. He's trying to do revive the economy, reform, etc. He has been talking about. But the common man on the ground is not fully convinced, and the one aspect of that is people postponing marriages or not showing the kind of interest they would have shown, let us say, 25 years back, if that.
So thank you very much, Dr. Govindswamy.